Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for House of Cards Season 4, Episodes 10 through 13. This video is where I review the final 4 episodes of House of Cards Season 4, so I'll have to give a spoiler warning for all of House of Cards Season 4. If you haven't seen all of Season 4, you may not want to watch this video, otherwise some things may be spoiled for you. So the last 4 episodes of the season were alright. I stand by my statement that Season 4 is much better than Season 3, and overall they dug themselves out of the rut that they were in and made the show interesting again. That being said, these last set of episodes weren't nearly as good as the first part of the season and tended to go a bit generic, and we did get some of the boring, mopey stuff that I hated about Season 3 in these last set of episodes. So let's start with episode 10. This episode deals with Kathy Durant trying to steal the presidency nomination away from Frank as retribution for him trying to out her as vice president, or maybe even get rid of her current position as Secretary of State. So in response, Frank makes makes up a crisis with Aiko in order to get him and Kathy away from the convention and to give him some alone time with Kathy under the guise of dealing with the foreign crisis. But much as he did with Conway, he just spent all of the meeting he was supposed to be discussing Aiko with Kathy talking political strategy instead, and he realized he solely underestimated her, as she was smart enough to see what he was up to. Personally, I think it was dumb of them to offer her adversary Secretary of State. He should have been genuine about their offer to help her, but I'm not sure that they were, which means neither is Kathy, and of course she wouldn't appreciate being used in such a manner. So Frank has it out with Kathy and offers to, have her keep her job, and he dangles over the fact that he has the better story because it was Claire that negotiated the truce with the Russians, and the fact Claire's mother just died gives her the sympathy vote. But then, when those arguments didn't work on her, he tells her about how he killed Zoe Barnes and Rousseau and then threatens her, but then he laughs it off like he's joking. But of course, I think the underlining message is that Kathy is to understand that he's not joking, or at least that it's a possibility. So she eventually gives in to him, which personally I thought was a bit silly that she only gave in to him under the threat of death, but whatever. But then in one of his asides to the audience, Frank says he realizes he has to get rid of Kathy sooner or later because he can't trust her anymore. That, I think, isn't very smart, but whatever. So let me talk about the whole idea of the presidential candidate coming under question at a convention. Kathy, a person who never ran in the first place, became a possibility, and Dunbar, who had already dropped out, became a possibility again. Now I know this is technically possible, just like it's technically possible that the Queen of England could declare war on the country, but practically it never happens. In fact, if a nominee who was the clear winner of the primary was trying to be replaced by politicians at a convention, there'd be holy hell to pay, and this episode didn't even delve into that at all. It tried to act like the voters were perfectly okay with this, which they would not be at all, There's even talk that this might happen in the Republican convention this year to unseat Donald Trump, and Trump promises that if this happens, there would be riots as a result. So I'm not saying that this couldn't happen. I'm saying that this episode underplayed the absolute outrage that would occur if it did, as it's basically taking power away from the people and giving it to the few politicians, which people would not be okay with. So other than this, we get the amazing storyline with my 2 favorite characters, Claire's mother and Tom the author. The one storyline that I always wanted to see. Now, if you can't tell, I'm being heavily sarcastic. I hate these 2 characters. I know I'm supposed to feel sad that Claire's mother died, but I'm sorry, I don't. And those scenes where Tom and Claire fell for each other, oh please. That scene where Claire and Tom first touched hands and looked at each other, I was screaming at my computer. I was like, no, please, no. God damn it, this is so cliche. So my rating for episode 10 out of 10 is a 4 poor. The convention was so unrealistic, I couldn't get over that, sorry. The side plot with Claire was so boring and cliche, although some of the political maneuvering was somewhat interesting, but yeah, definitely one of the weaker episodes of the season. So next we come to episode 11, where Claire has officially been confirmed as Frank's vice president. Frank's health prevents him from traveling, so he has to stay behind while Claire goes on the campaign trail for him, and of course Tom goes with her, and they continue their stupid affair. In fact, it deepens. But of course Frank is no idiot, and he can figure out what's going on, and he invites Tom to the White House, where he basically tells him it's all good, man. In fact, the episode ends with the three of them having breakfast together after Claire and Tom spent the night together, meaning they have this kind of threesome type relationship or understanding, which may have been somewhat interesting had we not already got the storyline in season 1 with the art guy that Claire was having an affair with, that Frank was completely okay with. So, not only are they doing a ridiculous storyline with a stupid author guy, they're repeating the same storylines that they've already done. So earlier I talked about how the show is bringing back every character who was in the show before this season, and I said all they needed to do was bring back Freddy to make it complete, and ta-da, here he is! So we get a scene where he tells Frank he's leaving the White House, and Frank is sad and suggests to have dinner together where he can make him ribs, and Freddy freaks the fuck out and calls Frank a motherfucker. I honestly didn't really care for this scene, and this had actually more to do with the fact that I hated what they did with Freddy's character. They kind of ruined him when they ruined the ribs joint. Once he lost his job, he ceased being an interesting character, and now he blows up at Frank for what seems to me to be no good reason. Now an argument could be made that he has every right to hate Frank, and I think that's a fair point, but either way, I'm not really interested anymore. So, we get another side plot about Doug becoming attached to the widow of the man he killed by bumping him from the transplant list. He donated a shitload of money to her, so she reached out to him, and he forms another creepy obsession with her. Fuck this guy. Just kill him off already. Jesus. And we also get a side plot with Hammerschmidt going after Frank, and he gets officially sponsored at a newspaper after being able to dig up some dirt on him. And he gathers that dirt from talking to Remy, who of course doesn't speak too highly of him. But all this time the investigation was about Lucas's allegations that he had something to do with Zoe and Russo's death. In fact, he seemed to be onto something when he talked to that pizza guy who identified Meacham. But now all of a sudden his investigation changed to be about the shady political maneuvers he has done to become president and the other shady things he did in season 1 and 2. And indeed, later on, Hammerschmidt even outright says he thinks Lucas's allegations are ridiculous, but those were the allegations that got him started on the investigation in the first place. I think it's just the writers realizing that they couldn't have him expose something so big, so they switched it to be about other shady things he did, and I call BS on that switch. And I also think that the scene where Freddy beats the shit out of Hammerschmidt was completely unnecessary, but that's just me. So my rating for episode 11 is a 5 average. This episode was mostly side plots. Those side plots were mostly boring or ridiculous or both. However, there were some really interesting aspects of the episode and the political maneuvering, the most interesting being the scene where Remy and Hammerschmidt play the game of Never Have I Ever, way of Remy covertly giving Hammerschmidt information. That was a pretty good scene. So next we come to episode 12, which is where they show the show suddenly tries to be 24 rather than House of Cards when they introduce a storyline where a family is taken hostage by terrorists working for Ico, and they threaten to kill the hostages unless their demands are met, which include the release of their leader from Guantanamo Bay. However, the terrorists demand to negotiate with Conway rather than Frank, and of course Frank uses this to his political advantage as he goes along with them having Conway involved. So if they fail, Conway can share in the blame in the voters' eyes. So we get a lot of scenes where the Conways are in the White House meeting with Claire and Frank, which was somewhat interesting. But as I said, the show seems to want to be like 24 all of a sudden with this hostage negotiation, and as interesting as it was, it didn't feel like I was watching House of Cards. It felt like I was watching the wrong show. And we also get a bit more about Conway's VP, the general, getting fed up with Conway doing what's right for him politically rather than the most effective thing to do to fight Aiko, which was the whole reason he left Frank in the first place. So he learned the hard way that Conway is really no better than Frank. And we also continue Hammerschmidt's side plot where he goes after Frank and he meets with the former president that Frank screwed over to get him to speak out against Frank. Meanwhile, Remy and Jackie Sharp agree to go to Hammerschmidt together, even if it means that their affair is going to be exposed. They decided it's more important to go after Frank than worry about their own affairs. And frankly, I'm more interested in this storyline than the 24 style storyline about hostages, because it seems to me they're actually going somewhere with this Hammerschmidt being, trying to discredit Frank rather than Hammerschmidt simply being dismissed or killed like has always happens in the past, which is great that they're finally doing something different. So my rating for episode 12 out of 10 is a 6 good. An okay episode with a plot that feels more like 24 than House of Cards, and a bit of interesting political maneuvering, including the heightening of Hammerschmidt's storyline, which I'm glad that they're doing something with. So finally, we get to the season finale, episode 13, which decides to end the season about an epic political struggle on a storyline about terrorists and hostage takers. So at this point, the terrorists released two of the hostages, which were recovered safe and sound, but they retained one of them. So Claire comes up with a plan to use the terrorist leader, whom the hostage takers are demanding released, and Claire meets with him to try to manipulate him to getting them to get the hostage takers to stand down. It's interesting that Claire exposed how the terrorist religious fundamentalist is just an act for him to acquire power, and he counters with that her devotion to freedom and democracy is also just an act to gain power, and she's like, oh, so I'm glad we understand each other. So that was awesome. So while the terrorist show is going on, political maneuvering continues behind the scenes where Frank blackmails a Republican politician to expose Conway's lie and attempt to manipulate the Republicans in Congress to discredit Frank. And so Conway starts to spin out of control. Meanwhile, Hammerschmidt plans to attack and make his plans known to Frank's campaign and asks to speak to them, and these scenes were awesome. God, it was so good to see Seth and Doug freak the fuck out over Hammerschmidt's article. Personally, I would love for Hammerschmidt to expose Frank, but of course to do so would mean the end of the show, and the show has been renewed for season 5. Personally, I hope they make it the last season and end it with Hammerschmidt taking Frank down, but somehow I doubt they'll do that, but I can dream. But anyway, the scene where Hammerschmidt confronts Frank about what he knows was absolutely awesome. I love this so much. This is the scene I've been waiting for since season 1, and it was glorious as Frank tries to bully and manipulate Hammerschmidt from stepping down, but he's not intimidated at all, and it was awesome. So after Hammerschmidt made it clear he poses a threat to Frank, they focus on trying to free the remaining hostage in order to look like a hero, but that goes south when the terrorist leader pretends to go along with Claire to speak to the hostage takers, but instead he tells them to kill the hostage unless he's free. So Frank decides to go the other way and declare outright war. He refuses to give in to the terrorists, and when the hostage is killed, he declares absolute and total war on Aiko and plans to annihilate them. And of course, this is just a cover to distract people from Hammerschmidt's article, and personally, I think this is the most accurate portrayal of that House of Cards has ever done, by portraying war as just an excuse for political maneuvering and politicians' personal political gain. And thus, season 4 of House of Cards ends. So my rating for episode 13 is an 8, extremely good. I'm still not thrilled about the use of 24 storytelling in House of Cards, but this episode did get back to what the show was all about: Frank manipulating people and doing shit just for political gain, and the story that a president would go to war to avoid a politically damaging article was so awesome. It reminds me a lot of the movie Wag the Dog. So overall, while this wasn't the best way to end the season, it was pretty effective and true to the style of House of Cards. So that's it for my review of House of Cards Season 4, episodes 10 through 13. Be sure to check back here next week as I do my overall review of House of Cards Season 4. And be sure to check out my channel for many more videos on other shows like Game of Thrones, Star Trek, The Walking Dead, Better Call Saul, Vikings, Daredevil, and more. And be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.